So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we're looking at T.S. Eliot's poem Preludes, which is part of the longer collection of poems entitled Proof Walk and Other Observations. So we began with this text already and we had one lecture on it, and we just hopefully all of us have an idea about the setting of the poem and the atmosphere that the poem is trying to depict through a certain kind of representation of politics. So the atmosphere is one of alienation, is one of metropolitan alienation, is one of the drudgery and the mechanical existence of modern man in a metropolis. And it's also about the entire idea of being lonely, the entire idea of being broken, and this brokenness and loneliness. They're represented through a certain kind of narrative technique, and that narrative technique often appropriates a metonymic mode of appropriation, metonymic mode of representation, sorry. So the metonymic mode is very clearly represented in a way in which the human body is divided, is broken down into certain fragments, right? And also the way in which certain inanimate objects are humanized. So the irony over here is the inanimate objects are humanized, and the human objects, the human beings over here, they anonymize at the same time they are mechanized. Right, so we have this entire setting of anonymity, the entire atmosphere of anonymity, standardization and uniformity. So, for instance, if you remember the last line of the second stanza with which we ended yesterday, the last lecture, the whole idea of raising all the hands raised in dingy shades in 1,000 furnished rooms. So the focus is again on the hands raised in dingy shades in 1,000 furnished rooms. So it almost appears like a collective activity, an anonymous collective activity, where there's no individual agency, there's no individuality left, right? So all the hands are coming together and collectively raising the shades in 1,000 furnished rooms. So the rooms are all furnished in a very similar way. The hands are, representing the bigger, broader human body, which in turn represents the human self. So the self is fragmented at so many levels, the level of the body, the level of the mind, the level of intention, etc. So among the different things that this urban metropolis or the metropolitan life generates is an idea of anonymity, the idea of a collective activity, which is not to say collective in a democratic sense, it's collective in a standardized sense, a forcibly standardized sense, right? So there's no individual agency left, there's no uniqueness, so to say, even at the level of motor movements, even the motor movements, the hand movements, the foot movement, the eye movement, those movements, the level of motor movements, also they take place in a very, very anonymized, standardized way, right? So the standardization is part of the metropolitan lifestyle over here, which is something which the poem is representing through a very, very visual narrative, and the narrative, of course, is very cinematic, and it does appropriate the montage quality of cinema, early cinema especially, of which Eliot was extremely aware. Now we'll move on to the third stanza, where we have a human figure, and it's obviously unnamed, but if you take a look at the description of the figure, one could hazard a guess, maybe this is a description of a prostitute, a woman who sells her body, a woman who is recovering from a very hard day's work. And in that sense, the figure of the prostitute becomes important, because what the poem tries to depict is that every human being becomes or prostitutes himself or herself in the sense of becoming a reified object. So every human body becomes reified. So reification, R-E-I-F-I-C-A-T-I-O-N, reification is a process through which an entity becomes a commodity. Everything comes with a price tag, everything becomes a commodity. So the figure of the prostitute over here, like the figure of the lonely cab horse, are both examples of prostitution, are both examples of commodification, both examples of alienation. So the alienation of the commodified entity, the alienation of the commodified subject. So the human subject is so alienated because it's commodified, it's reified. So reification and alienation, two classic Marxist terms, are depicted over here through very, very interesting montage techniques. So the figure of the prostitute, the figure of the woman over here, who's recovering from a very hard day's work, from a very hard day's drudgery of work, and just has this moment's epiphany, just one little moment of epiphany, where she inhabits a pure moment of psychological time, a pure moment of real time, so to say. And if you remember, we talked about real time and clock time or clock time or psychological time. In some details, we looked at the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And of course, the philosopher that you should be studying for this is someone called Henri Bergson, Henribergson. Bergson's notion, or Bergson's thesis on time, is absolutely foundational in terms of how time gets represented, or how temporality gets represented in modernism, in modernist literature, or at least in high modernist literature. So let's take a look at the third stanza and see how that plays out, the different orders of temporality and embodiment. Because embodiment, remember, is also a very, very temporal phenomenon in Eliot's early poetry. It's not just a spatial phenomenon. So if you look, for instance, if you take a look at the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which we finished already, we see over there, even there, the human subject wants to attain embodiment, wants to extend the embodiment in the room of woman come and go talking in Michelangelo. So it's that kind of a space which is also temporal in quality, the woman come and go talking in Michelangelo. So embodiment is a spatio-temporal activity in Eliot's early poetry. And we find the same kind of spatio-temporal politics, the same kind of spatio-temporal setting is represented here in the third stanza. So this should be on the screen, and let's take a look at the third stanza in this poem. You tossed a blanket from the bed, you lay upon your back and waited. You dozed and watched the night revealing the 1,000 sordid images of which your soul was constituted. They flickered against the ceiling, and when all the world came back and the light crept up between the shutters and you heard the sparrows in the gutters, you had such a vision of the street as the street hardly understands, sitting along the bed's edge where you curl the papers from your hair or collapse the yellow soles of feet in the palms of both soiled hands. Now, if you take a look at the opening, the verbs are important over here. You tossed a blanket from the bed. So there's a movement at the very opening of this particular stanza. The blanket has been tossed away from the bed. So it is indicative of some kind of an energetic movement, an energetic motor mechanism. But then, of course, the whole idea of that is undercut by the inertia and the boredom and the loneliness and the nothingness, which get represented in the subsequent movement and the subsequent verbs. The human subject over here is said that the representation is you lay upon your back and waited. So again, the whole idea of waiting for something to happen, lying on your back on the bed and waiting for something to happen. And then you dozed and watched the night revealing the 1,000 sordid images of which your soul was constituted. So again, look at the way in which this very cinematic montage technique is represented over here. So the whole idea, the whole life, the whole image of the soul, the whole content of the human soul is projected as if through a projector on a ceiling in which everything gets played out. And the human subject lies on a bed after tossing the blanket and looks at a soul getting played out on the ceiling through a sense of projection, through a movement of projection. So projection becomes important over here. It's almost like a cinematic projector. And the entire visuality is very cinematic over here. So the human subject is lying on the bed and looking at the content of a soul getting played out in the ceiling bit by bit. So it's very fragmented, it's very visual, and it's very, very montage-like. So the cinematic montage is very, very progressive, is very evidently progressive in Eliot's early poetry, and this is a very classic case in point, where the soul is getting played out, soul becomes a visual object which is consumed by the human subject lying on the bed. And then, of course, the whole idea of flickering against the ceiling. They flickered against the ceiling. So the flicker is an important word over here, because that is a very classic cinematic term. So the visual images, they flicker out of a projector, right? So the eyes become the projector, and the soul becomes the medium of the film, which gets played out on a big screen. So again, look at the way in which certain abstract, almost intangible, and profound entities such as a soul, such as a human mind, such as a human consciousness, they are represented, they are perceived, they are consumed through certain very mechanical metaphors, through certain very tangible objects, tangible technological objects, right? So therein lies a very interesting entanglement between the tangible and the intangible, between the organic and the inorganic in Eliot's early poetry, where the human being is represented as an inorganic machine, whereas machines are getting more and more humanized. So that completely blurs away the boundary between the organic and the inorganic. It blurs away the boundary between what is tangible and what is intangible, what is profound and what is flippant, and what is mystical and what is material. So the mystical experience over here is represented through material markers, at the ceiling, the soul getting flickered out of the human mind, and the eye looking at the content of the soul flickering on the ceiling. It's like a cinema projector. It's like a cinema screen. So the ceiling becomes a cinema screen in which the life narrative plays out as if like a film, right? And that is a very important way in which you remember that modernism was very, very interested in the new forms of technology, especially cinema or radio or typewriter. So all these things keep coming up quite heavily in Eliot's early poetry. If we move on to Wasteland after this particular poem, we find that the technology, the markers of technology are sort of completely mapping the metropolis, not just the metropolis or the world outside, but also the way in which human consciousness plays, the human consciousness perceives itself. So the awareness of awareness, almost like a meta-conscious and the meta-cognitive quality, where you're aware of being aware. So even those experiences are mediated through machines. Even those experiences are mediated through markers of technology. So over here, we have the image of a woman, presumably a woman who's lying on the bed, tossing the blanket from the bed. And it could also be a man, it could also be a worker, it could also be, a laborer who's coming back at the end of a very long day and finds himself completely drained out and exhausted, and suddenly having this image, this epiphany, or this epiphanic image of his own life getting played out on a ceiling. The ceiling becomes, in a sense, a cinema screen, and the consciousness over here becomes a cinema projector, in which projects or throws out or hurls out the content of the life or the content of the soul across the ceiling. Okay, so that becomes an important visual grammar of representation. So they flickered against the ceiling. And when all the world came back and the light crept up between the shutters, and I heard the sparrows in the gutters. So when the light comes back, so when the world comes back and the light crept up between the shutters, so the light entering to the shutters is indicative of the beginning of the day. So the whole idea of this nocturnal epiphany, where the human subject sees himself as projected on a screen and the ceiling, and that experience of watching your life on a ceiling, it gets interrupted only when the world comes back or the world wakes up again, which is to say, it becomes daytime again, and the light creeps between the shutters. So when you say, when the light crept up between the shutters and I heard the sparrows in the gutters. So again, the gutter is an important image over here, an important metaphor of drudgery, an important metaphor of dirt, or the filth of the modern metropolis, or rather the wasted quality of the modern metropolis. So the modern metropolis over here is essentially a wasteland. And of course, when we move on to Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, which is a text which we'll cover right after this, we find that the entire metropolis becomes a wasteland. It's almost like a cactus existence, where nothing grows, where there's no fertility, where there's no nourishment, there's no human connect, there's no empathy whatsoever. Right? So the image of the gutters, or the image of the sparrows in the gutters, is indicative of the drudgery or the filth of the dirt in modern life, right? And of course, the light coming back is an interruption of the epiphany. So again, look at the way in which the photoplay is important in Eliot's early poetry, how light and shade or light and shadow are played against each other. So light is not always indicative of illumination in a spiritual, mystical sense. Rather, light can also be used over here as an image of darkness, as an instrument of darkness, as something which accentuates the darkness more heavily. Right? So over here, when the light comes between the shutters, when the light is said to be creeping up between the shutters, that's the time where the sparrows are heard in the gutters, which means it's a break of the day. The dawn is breaking and the day is about to begin, which is also to say that the epiphany, the nocturnal epiphany, is coming to an end. And that becomes, again, it goes back to the whole idea of clock time and real time. So the entire epiphany, or the entire experience of epiphany, is inhabited or inhabits itself in the psychological time, in the mind time, and the real time of the speaker. And that real time, or that psychological time, gets interrupted when the clock time comes back, or the awareness of clock time comes back, or the machinery or the markers of clock time comes back, when the light is creeping up between the shutters and the sparrows are heard from the gutters, which means these are like acoustic markers of the beginning of the day. And these acoustic markers are important because that cuts into the whole experience of psychological time. That psychological time comes to an end. But before it comes to an end, the final epiphany is represented. The final epiphany is experienced. What is epiphany? You had such a vision of the street as the street hardly understands. Right? So again, the street is an important metaphor over here. And the fourth stanza, you find the street becomes a metaphor of something which is trampled on over and over again. So again, like the lonely cab horse, like the lonely and tired feet, walking towards the coffee stands, like the tired human body, tossing a blanket from the bed and watching its own life being played out on the ceiling. The street over here is humanized. The street over here becomes a metaphor of a very sordid metropolitan existence, which is one of torture, which is one of suffering, which is one of endless suffering, which is one of being trampled on by incessant feet. It's something which is painful and alienating and completely agency-less. So again, the agency-lessness of existence is something which is highlighted over here. There's no human agency available. There's no available agency whatsoever, right? And again, this whole idea, the whole denial of agency is important, because what that also means is that a human being is consumed by the machinery of the metropolis, right? And this act of consumption pervades throughout the poem. And this is something which we saw also in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, where the human subject was supposedly consumed by the metropolis and the machinery, right? So that becomes an important image over here. So the street image is important because A, it's a spatial image, a spatial symbol of the metropolis, and B, it becomes a further accentuation of the suffering of modern man, wherein it's a space which gets trampled on incessantly, and there's no agency whatsoever in terms of any dialogic existence. It's just one space which gets trampled on endlessly throughout the day, right? So that image is important over here. And also that connects to the broader issue which we have in hand, which is how mechanical, inanimate objects are humanized and human beings are mechanized. And that's something which, with that interplay of machines getting humanized and human beings being mechanized, is something which we see more powerfully in The Wasteland, which is a text which will start after this. So that image, that epiphany, the vision of the street, which is just one light bulb moment which comes in before the day begins again, is an image which the street hardly understands. So you have a vision of the street which the street hardly understands, which is to say that the street becomes a metaphor of urban modernity, or the modern condition of man, which doesn't understand or doesn't have any knowledge of his own suffering. So suddenly this epiphany places you or situates you in an objective position, wherein you can take a critical look, an objective look at humanity, right? And that becomes a privileged position. And like all privileged position, this is strictly temporal in quality. It will end at some point, right? And you come back to the clock time again, you come back to the daily time again. But you do manage to inhabit a little bit of time which is not clock time, psychological and real time, wherein you take a look, a privileged look into the condition of modernity, and the street becomes a metaphor of that condition, which it itself doesn't understand. So the street has no awareness of its own suffering, just like the modern metropolis has no awareness of its own suffering. So this figure of the human figure, which could be a prostitute, which could be a factory laborer, which could be anything, is just a suffering human subject, which is who is commodified over and over again. So that suffering human subject ironically becomes the modern prophet, becomes the seer of the modern metropolis, in the same way as Marlowe was a seer in Heart of Darkness, this very exhausted seer who nobody understands, who nobody believes, and who cannot himself bring about to tell the story of what he had seen, right? So the seer is essentially important in modernity, and that's why we have so many blind prophets in Eliot's early poetry, including Tiresias, who appears in The Wasteland. So this image of the street not understanding its own suffering, and the human being, the trampled human subject, suddenly getting a glimpse of suffering becomes important, and it's the only epiphany available in this particular poem. So sitting along the bed's edge, where you curl the papers from your hair, or collapse the yellow soles of feet in the palms of both soiled hands. Again, look at the adjectives: yellow, soiled, curled. So these are images of enervation. These are images of decadence. So this probably indicates the material markers of prostitution to a certain extent. So the papers on the hair getting curled out, it's a very seedy setting, it's a very decadent, seedy setting, and it's typical of a working class neighborhood in an urban metropolis where things are very, very decadent, things are very, very impoverished, and everyone's struggling to fit into the rhythms of modern existence. So this image of the prostitute, this image of the suffering subject becomes important over here as she's sitting, curling the papers from the hair, or collapsing yellow soles of feet. So it's like a fetal image, a fetal position, where the human subject is clasping the yellow soles of feet. So it's like going back to a fetal position, which is also an image of dehumanization, going back to a situation or inhabiting a situation where you don't really have any human agency, right? So it's not really an agentic position, it's an agency-less position, a fetal position, and that's the position that is described over here. The human subject clasping the soles of his own feet, and the soles happen to be yellow as well, which is the color of jaundice, the classic color of jaundice, which is to say is an image of lifelessness. And again, you can connect it back to the withered leaves about your feet with which this poem began. Now, the evening newspapers and withered leaves, which also were markers of exhaustion and death. Right? So the same markers are continued over here in a more domestic and a more interior setting. So the interior setting, of course, is not one of homeliness. It's just the opposite. It's one of unhomeliness. Right? It's one of uncanny, or unheimlich. So the whole point of being unhomely is represented over here. Even the home is not home. It's just a space where people come and go and trample you like the street gets trampled on. And that image accentuates human suffering. So even the interior space, which is supposed to comfort you and offer you nourishment, it does just the opposite. So again, you can connect it back to the lonely cab horse tied to a corner of the street and steaming and stamping with no forward movement. So again, the motor movements in Eliot's early poetry are important because the motor movements, they offer no direction. So they're essentially directionless movements. So again, the motor movements are further markers of importance, further markers of destinationlessness. In Eliot's early poetry, or directionlessness. There's no direction or destination, or no movement in a scientific sense of the term. There's no movement forward at all. It's just one Sisyphean quality where you continue doing the same thing over and over again. Okay, so the stanza ends with the yellow soles of feet and the soiled hands. Again, look at the very metonymic representation which is used to depict the human body. It's never depicted as a totality. It's never depicted fully. So forget about the human self. Even the human body is not represented fully. And this fragmented quality of representation is obviously reflective of the alienation which is generated by the modern metropolis, where there's no totality available. There's no total sense of self. There's no total sense of awareness. So even awareness, a sense of self, these get interrupted all the time. And that very interrupted embodiment is something which is represented through this very metonymic mode, where the focus is on feet, on hands, on fingers, etc., but never as a totality. So the human body never appears as a totality at all in Eliot's early poetry, and that's something which is worth noticing. Okay, so the final stanza of Preludes, it gives us certain images which are Christian in quality, but at the same time which continues the image of the suffering man in a modern metropolis. The stanza begins with, his soul stretched out across the skies that fade behind a city block, or trampled by insistent feet at 4 and 5 and 6 o'clock. In short square fingers stuffing pipes, and even in newspapers and eyes assured of certain certainties, the conscious of a blackened street, impatient to assume the world. So again, if you take a look at the whole idea of the soul stretching across the skies, which is the image with which the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock began, where the supposed call, the romantic call to go for a walk, is immediately followed by a patient etherized upon a table, where the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. So the medical metaphor and the mystic metaphor, they combine together to create a very complex cognitive condition, with the medical and the mystical, they're interlinked together to create this unhealthy, diseased human existence. So a similar kind of setting, a similar kind of image is represented offered over here, where the image of the soul stretched out across the skies, which is also reminiscent of the medieval rack of torture, where the human subject is stretched out across a torture rack and tortured. So this medieval rack of torture keeps coming back in Eliot's early poetry, and the soul, of course, becomes the subject of torture, who is stretched out across the skies and nailed at different points. So it's like a Christ figure of suffering, and the entire modern metropolis becomes the subject of suffering over here. That fade behind a city block. So again, a city block is something which hides or conceals certain sections of the soul, or trampled by insistent feet at 4 and 5 and 6 o'clock. So these are obviously the very temporal rhythms of modernity, where certain sections of the street gets trampled at certain sections of the day. So again, look at the spatio-temporal quality of representation over here. So that particular street gets certain kind of behavior at certain times of the day, at 4 and 5 and 6 o'clock. So those are times of the day where certain tramplings happen. So trampled by insistent feet. So the insistent feet come, trample, and go away. Again, the focus is on feet. And again, these are very cinematic techniques of representation. If you take a look at, those of you interested in the relationship between modernism and cinema, I did mention David Trotter's work on modernism and cinema, but also if you take a look at some of the German expressionist cinema, for instance, Fritz Lang's film Metropolis, or Robert Wien's film The Cabinet of Caligari. So those are German expressionist films where the focus is on always a human motor movements to certain metonymic modes, the hand, the feet, the boot, the shoe, the pipe. Those are the ones which get magnified and represented in terms of the rhythms of modern life, which is to say everything becomes anonymous, everything becomes standardized, everything becomes one collective orchestrated movement, which is obviously reflective of the denial of agency. No one can break away from the movement. There's no out of sync from that movement. Everything marches together as one machinery of modernity, right? So the insistent feed is like one march of modernity on a particular time of the day, and no one is out of sync, which is to say there's no agency outside of it. There's no agency available. So the motor movements, I repeat myself, the motor movements are very important in Eliot's early poetry, because the motor movements, the feet movements, the hand movements, the finger movements, the eye movements, they're all orchestrated, they're all collective, and they all inform this entire industry of anonymity, which is the modern metropolis. Right? That's something which keeps getting represented over and over again in Eliot's early poetry. And of course, that continues, it's further metonymized with the short, square fingers stuffing pipes. Again, the pipes, the fingers stuffing the pipes. So again, we don't really see any face. So the entire facelessness of modernity is indicated with the vast anonymity of the metropolis. No one knows anyone over here. It's completely an industry of anonymity. So the short, square fingers, stuffing pipes, and even in newspapers and eyes. So again, even newspapers are indicative of the trash of the modern metropolis, because by the time the evening comes, the newspapers become useless. They get liquidated of importance. There's no importance left whatsoever. So newspapers become just trash papers, right? So again, we'll focus more on the entire production of waste in the modern metropolis. And when we look at Eliot's wasteland, when we look at how the River Thames gets littered with different kinds of waste products. But even here in Preludes, we have different kinds of markers of urban waste which get represented, like the evening newspapers, which keep coming up over and over again. And eyes are assured of certain certainties. So there's an ironic tone over here, which is quite interestingly represented. Certain certainties. The eyes are assured of certain certainties, which is to say there's this vast uncertainty of existence, but that's the only certainty left. The vast uncertainty. And again, one can connect it back to The Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe comes back and knows the only certainty available is uncertainty. And that's why he can't tell a full story in classic realism, because the story that he knows, the story that he's experienced, cannot be told in a certain frame of classic realism. And that is part of the failure in Heart of Darkness. So that kind of a failure of storytelling, that kind of failure to narrate the experience is something which is represented here as well. And finally, we have the image of the street again, the conscience of a blackened street, impatient to assume the world. So the blackened street becomes a metaphor of the suffering human subject. The blackened street becomes a metaphor of, let's say, urban sin or metropolitan sin. And of course, we can connect it back to the figure of the prostitute just at the beginning, the previous stanza, where the fallen woman, or even if it's a laborer, it's never clear the figure is male or female. But even if it's a laborer, it's indicative of a reified human subject. And of course, reification, this very classic Marxist term, it generates alienation. Again, two very classic Marxist terms, reification, alienation. And alienation over here doesn't happen inside a factory, or strictly speaking, just inside a factory, but also outside the factory. It happens everywhere. It happens even inside the homely space, which becomes increasingly unhomely with the rhythms of modern life. So the blackened street over here becomes a reservoir of the entire sordid quality, the sordid suffering of modernity, and hence the blackened quality just becomes a reservoir, a very condensed metaphor of suffering in modern life, which is impatient to assume the world. So the entire world is being assumed and consumed. So there's slightly cannibalistic quality about the street as well, which sort of eats up the modern metropolis and eats up the human subjects in the metropolis, who then behave like, essentially like machines, who are belched out of that particular machinery. Okay. And finally, we have a first-person presence over here, where the human subject appears as I. I am moved by fancies that are curled around these images and cling, the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. So we have this image, this sort of Christ metaphor over here, the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. That's the only solace left. So that's the only solace available, the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. But even here, there's some degree of irony over here. If you take a look at the nouns, if I take a look at the epithets over here, notion and fancies. I'm moved by fancies that are curled around these images, not imagination, but fancies, right? So it's more of a degraded imagination, and more of a degenerated imagination, and that's the only faculty left. That's the only belief system left, fancies, not imagination, not the glamour of imagination, but a more degraded, more degenerated faculty, which is fancy. But that's the only available faculty left, and I'm clinging on to it. That's what the human subject is saying. I'm clinging on to it. I'm moved by fancies that are curled around these images, images of enervation, exhaustion, and despair. the different markers of all these affect. And I'm moved by the fancies that are curled around it. And I'm clinging on to this one solace left. And what is a solace left? What is the only consolation left? What's the only belief system left? The notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. So the endlessness of suffering is something which is represented over here, which could be a Christ metaphor, which could be a metaphor of the suffering prophet, but it's the only solace left. The notion, the idea of some infinitely suffering thing, right? So the suffering is endless. The suffering is something which doesn't appear to offer any redemption, but it is gentle, it is infinite, and it is endless. So the gentility of suffering and the endlessness of suffering is something which is represented over here as some kind of a pseudo-solace, right? And the pseudo-quality, the incomplete quality of this consolation is hinted at, is reflected with the use of the word fancy. And the use of the word, curls, and the notion of some infinitely gentle. It's not a belief, it's a notion, it's an idea, which may or may not be a belief in its own right. And the final image with which the poem ends is again a very Sisyphean activity, where the speaker is pointing out to the listener and addressing the listener and saying, wipe your hand across the mouth and laugh. The worlds revolve like ancient women gathering fuel in vacant lots. The final image is actually very, very interesting. If we take a look at it, it could be read in both ways. It could be an image of fulfillment, where the vacant lots are getting filled in with fuel, which is an image of hope, or image of consolation, image of redemption. But if you take a look at it in another way, the lots are always vacant. So no matter how much you fill in, they always remain vacant lots. Right? So gathering fuel in vacant lots could also be a Sisyphean activity, where you just go on doing something which will never be fulfilled. So the poem ends in a very open-ended way, and both readings are equally acceptable. So there's a degree of ambivalence with which the poem ends. It could be an image of fulfillment, an image of positivity, an image of preservation, an image of fertility, an image of, it's obviously a harvest metaphor which is being used. So ancient woman gathering fuel in vacant lots. But the word vacant it sort of begs to be read in a particular way as well, which is to say the lots will always stay vacant. So no matter how much fuel you fill in, it's just going to stay vacant forever. So which is a continuation of the Sisyphean quality of modern man, which is indicative of, which is reflected elsewhere as well in this particular poem. So the poem ends in a very ambivalent, open-ended way, and both readings are equally acceptable. But just to recap very quickly, the entire poem Preludes, it's like a cinematic montage. You get 4 different shots taken together in 4 different settings, but they all come together to create one narrative of desolation, one narrative of despair and complete alienation. And interestingly, the visual narrative over here is very cinematic in quality. We have long shots of the metropolis. We have long shots of leaves falling, newspapers curling around the street, and then you have close-ups on feet, on fingers, on pipes, but we never get a totality of existence, and that's the whole point. It is never a totality available over here. So the human life over here is essentially fragmented and alienated, and that fragmentation and alienation is represented with a very interesting and innovative use of metaphysical conceit as well as cinema techniques in Eliot's early poetry, which is something which you saw already in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So with that, we come to a conclusion on Preludes, and we'll move on to the Wasteland later in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.